The Arizona sun hung low over the horizon, spilling gold across the wide, untamed desert. Dust swirled in slow, lazy circles as a young cowboy named Luke Carver tightened the saddle on his chestnut horse. He was barely 22, a drifter with no family, no place to call home. Just a good aim, a sharp tongue, and a restless heart. He had spent the last few months working at the Coyote Ridge Ranch, where the cattle were mean and the pay was lean, but it was enough to keep him alive. The land was Apache country, rugged, sacred, and older than the memory of men. Luke knew better than to ride too far from the boundaries, yet his curiosity often dragged him into places where white men seldom tread. One afternoon, while chasing a runaway calf near the canyon's edge, he saw smoke rising in the distance. A small Apache camp, no more than 5 tents, stood in the shadow of the red cliffs. That's where he first saw her. She couldn't have been more than 10. A thin, barefoot girl with hair black as the ravens that circled above. She stood behind a horse, half hiding, half curious, her large amber eyes locked on him. The rest of the camp eyed Luke with suspicion, but the girl didn't flinch. She stepped out, holding a small clay doll, cracked and worn from play. Luke tipped his hat, pretending to be solemn. "Don't shoot me, miss," he joked softly under his breath, though no one could hear him. Then, with that mischievous spark he carried everywhere, he said to himself, "Pretty thing. When you grow up, I'll come back and marry you." It was a joke, a passing fancy spoken into the dust. The girl didn't understand his words, but something in his tone made her smile. A shy, knowing smile that stayed with him long after he rode away. For the next few months, Luke saw her from time to time, when he rode near the canyon. Her tribe had made peace with the local settlers, and sometimes she'd bring the ranch hands baskets of herbs or blankets her mother had woven. They called her Niali, which meant, "I love you," in her language, a name that Luke never forgot. The cowboy, wild and reckless, lived a fast life. Poker tables, bar fights, and long rides through endless prairie became his world. Yet, every so often, when the stars were bright and the whiskey ran thin, he'd think of that little Apache girl and the strange warmth in her eyes. He'd laugh it off and tell his friends, "Hell, I told her I'd marry her someday." It became a running joke among them. A tale told in saloons and campfires. But fate in the Wild West has a way of making jokes come true. Years passed. The war between settlers and Apaches flared again. Blood ran through the same canyons where peace once lingered. The Coyote Ridge Ranch was burned, and Luke left Arizona behind. He drifted from town to town, first as a ranch hand, then as a bounty hunter, and later, a man whose eyes had seen too much of death to believe in destiny. The child he once met was lost to time, buried somewhere the past he rarely revisited. One night, years later, as Luke sat beside a dying campfire outside the mining town of Silver Creek, he found himself remembering that day. The smile, the clay doll, and the soft hum of the desert wind. He wondered if she was still alive, or if war and hunger had swallowed her tribe whole. He shook his head, trying to brush it off, but his heart carried an ache he couldn't name. The next morning, he rode toward town, dust rising behind him like ghosts. Silver Creek had changed since his last visit. It had saloons, a church, and a small trading post run by an old Mexican couple. He stopped to buy supplies, tossing a coin on the counter. That's when he heard the old woman whisper something in Spanish, a tone half fearful, half reverent. "She came back," the woman said. "The Apache woman who walks with the wind." Luke frowned. "Who?" The woman crossed herself. "They say she was taken as a child when her tribe was destroyed, raised somewhere far. Now she's back, older, quiet, beautiful, lives near the old canyon. They call her the Spirit Bride." Something in Luke's chest shifted. The canyon, the camp, the girl. He left without another word, his horse pounding the dusty trail toward the red cliffs. The wind grew colder as he neared the place he had once stood as a foolish young man. The land felt the same, wild, sacred, whispering secrets through the sagebrush. And there, among the fading light, he saw her again. A woman this time. Tall, graceful, with hair still black as midnight and eyes that gleamed like amber fire. She stood beside a lone grave marked with Apache stones, her head bowed. When she turned, the years fell away in an instant, and Luke's heart forgot how to beat. He had joked once that he'd marry her when she grew up. Now, she had. And she had come back. The wind stirred between them, heavy with the ghosts of promises made and forgotten. Luke's breath caught as her eyes met his. No fear, no surprise. Only quiet recognition. It was as if she had always known this day would come. The desert held its breath, and somewhere deep inside, Luke realized, his joke had become her vow. The past was calling him home. The wind moaned softly through the red canyons, carrying the scent of rain and dust. Luke Carver sat astride his horse, staring at the woman who stood among the stones. Years had passed since he last rode through this land, yet the desert had not forgotten him, and neither had she. The woman known by the townsfolk as the spirit bride was no ghost. She was flesh and blood, yet she carried an aura that silenced the world around her. Her long dark hair flowed freely down her back, a streak of silver glinting in the sunlight, and her garments were stitched with beads and feathers that shimmered like stars. She moved with the calm of someone who belonged to the earth itself. Luke watched her place a small clay doll upon the grave, its cracked surface almost identical to the one she once held as a child. It was a relic of another life, a life neither of them had expected to cross again. He wanted to speak, to ask if she remembered the foolish cowboy who once joked about marrying her, but words had no place in the sacred silence of that canyon. Instead, he dismounted and stood still, his hat in hand, the desert wind stirring around him. The moment stretched long, filled with the echo of lost years and things unsaid. When she turned toward him, the same amber eyes met his. Time had changed them both, yet recognition flowed between them like water over stone. Luke felt a weight in his chest, a mixture of awe and guilt. He had lived rough, careless years while she had walked paths lined with loss and survival. He left the canyon without a word, but something in him refused to let go. That night, he could not sleep. He lay beside his campfire, staring at the stars while coyotes sang in the distance. The flame flickered against his weathered face as old memories crept back. Her laughter, the sunlit canyon, the promise he'd made in jest. It had been nothing more than a passing remark, a young man's teasing, yet now it returned to him with haunting clarity. Over the next few days, Luke lingered near Silver Creek. The town was small but restless. A mining settlement, trying to pretend it was civilized. The saloons overflowed with drifters and gamblers. The church struggled to tame sin, and behind every window, someone whispered about the spirit bride. Some said she was a healer who saved wounded animals and lost children. Others claimed she was cursed, bringing misfortune wherever she went. Luke didn't believe in curses, but he had seen enough of life to know that beauty and sorrow often walked hand in hand. One afternoon, while resting his horse by the creek, he caught sight of her again. She was gathering herbs by the water, her reflection shimmering beside her. Luke didn't approach this time. He simply watched, feeling something deep inside him stir. A strange, humbling admiration. She moved with purpose, her hands gentle but sure, her expression serene. The wilderness obeyed her, as if the wind itself bent to her presence. Word spread quickly that she had come seeking someone. No one knew who. Some thought it was her long-lost kin. Others whispered she was waiting for a man who once made her a promise. Luke tried to ignore the rumors, but they clung to him like the desert heat. Each time someone mentioned her, he felt a pull, a quiet force that drew him closer. One evening, after sunset, he found himself riding toward the canyon again. The sky burned orange fading into indigo, and the land glowed with the last breath of day. When he reached the clearing where she had stood, he noticed a circle of stones arranged carefully near the grave. At its center lay offerings, flowers, beads, and a small piece of cloth embroidered with the shape of a heart. It was then he realized that the grave belonged to her mother. The tribe that once lived here was gone, lost to disease, bullets, and time. But Niley had returned to honor what little remained. Luke knelt beside the grave, feeling the weight of years pressing on him. He had been young, foolish, and thoughtless. But something about this place and this woman made him question who he had become. His hands, once steady on a gun, now trembled slightly as he traced the edge of one of the stones. That night, the wind rose again, fierce and unrelenting. Storm clouds gathered over the desert, and lightning forked across the horizon. Luke took shelter beneath an old cottonwood near the canyon, the thunder rolling like distant drums. He thought of leaving Silver Creek come morning, of riding away before his heart got tangled in something he didn't understand. But fate had other plans. At dawn, the storm had passed, and a soft mist covered the valley. Luke rode into town to restock his supplies, but the moment he stepped into the trading post, he saw her again. She was speaking quietly with the old Mexican woman, trading a bundle of herbs for a small silver locket. When she turned, her gaze met his once more. This time, she did not look away. For a heartbeat, everything around them disappeared. The creak of the floorboards, the murmurs of other patrons, even the desert wind. Only that silent recognition remained, something stronger than coincidence, deeper than memory. She left before he could follow, vanishing down the dirt road toward the canyon. Yet she had dropped something behind. A small woven pouch, stitched with the same pattern he had seen on her cloth offering. When Luke picked it up, he found inside a single strand of hair tied with a red thread and a tiny stone shaped like a heart. He didn't know what it meant, but somehow he understood. That night, he didn't ride away. Instead, he made camp near the canyon again, watching the stars emerge one by one. The land felt alive around him, whispering secrets through the grass. Somewhere in that vast silence, he realized that the girl he once joked about marrying had not forgotten the words he'd spoken. For her, it had been more than a joke. It had been a promise, and she had come back to claim it. The desert was patient. It waited for those who owed it something. And now Luke Carver owed it everything. As the firelight flickered across his face, he made a quiet vow to himself, not out of guilt or nostalgia, but from a truth he couldn't deny anymore. He would find her again, not as the reckless cowboy she once knew, but as the man she deserved to meet. Far away, deep within the canyon, a faint glow of firelight appeared. Her camp. Luke saddled his horse. The past was no longer behind him. It waited just ahead, in the heart of the desert, with eyes of amber and a promise yet to be fulfilled. The night was calm after the storm. A pale moon floated over the canyons, bathing the red rocks in a ghostly light. Luke Carver rode slowly through the narrow pass, his horse's hooves stirring up small clouds of dust that glowed silver beneath the moon. The desert stretched out endlessly before him, silent except for the whisper of wind against stone. He followed the faint flicker of firelight in the distance, the same glow he had seen from his camp earlier that night. It pulsed softly against the horizon like a heartbeat, guiding him through the wilderness. Every step he took carried him closer to the past he had tried so long to forget. The canyon opened into a small clearing, hidden by the curve of the cliffs. There, beside the remains of an old Apache camp, burned a small fire surrounded by stones. The woman, Nayeli, sat beside it, her head bowed as she brushed sand from a small clay doll. It was the same kind of doll she once held as a child, its face cracked but lovingly mended with bits of resin. Around her, the desert seemed to hum with life. The call of night birds, the rustle of dry grass, the soft rhythm of her movements. Luke stopped at a distance, unwilling to break the spell. He watched her in silence, feeling a pull stronger than any he had known before. Something in her stillness spoke to the hollow places inside him. The wounds left by war, by loss, by a lifetime of drifting from one dusty horizon to the next. The woman who sat before him was no longer the child he had once teased. She was something else entirely. Something the desert itself had shaped. She had the strength of the land, and the calm of someone who had seen too much and survived it all. For a long while, he stayed there, unseen, watching the firelight dance across her face. Then, quietly, he turned away and made camp not far from hers. He didn't approach that night, nor the next. He simply stayed near, always at the edge of her world, unable to leave yet unsure how to step inside it. Days passed. Each morning, he watched her walk to the river to collect water or gather herbs from the rocky slopes. She seemed to know he was there, though she never turned or called out. It was as if the land itself had told her he was coming. The distance between them remained, a space filled with years of unspoken truth and forgotten laughter. One afternoon, Luke rode into Silver Creek for supplies. The townsfolk were whispering again. Stories about the Apache woman in the canyon. Some claimed she was performing old rituals, calling to spirits of her fallen tribe. Others said she was waiting for the man who had promised her marriage, when she was just a child. Luke said nothing. He simply collected his food and left, but the whispers followed him all the way out of town. He realized then that even the desert had ears, and that their story, once a forgotten joke, had taken on a life of its own. When he returned to the canyon that evening, the fire was gone. The small camp had been cleared, the ground swept clean as if she had never been there. Panic surged through him as he dismounted, scanning the horizon for any trace of her. Then he saw it. A trail of footprints leading into the narrow ravine that twisted deeper into the cliffs. He followed the path through the winding stone corridors until he came upon a place unlike any other. At the heart of the ravine stood a stone altar carved long ago, surrounded by ancient markings faded by wind and time. Offerings of beads, feathers, and stones lay scattered around it. And there, standing before the altar, was Naili. She stood motionless, her hands raised slightly as if listening to the wind. Around her, the air shimmered with heat and memory. Luke felt the weight of centuries pressing down on him. The echo of drums long silenced, the songs of a people lost but not forgotten. He understood then that she had not come back just for him. She had returned for something greater, for the promise her ancestors made to the land, to restore what was broken and honor what was lost. And somehow, his presence was part of that vow. The sun began to set, bleeding red and gold across the cliffs. Shadows deepened around them, and the wind carried the scent of sage and rain. Luke stepped closer, drawn by an invisible thread. For the first time in years, he felt as if he was exactly where he was meant to be. That night, he stayed near the altar while she tended the fire. The desert seemed to breathe with them, the flames reflecting in her eyes. He watched her move with the same grace he remembered from years ago, though now it was touched by something older, more powerful, a quiet dignity that made her seem almost ethereal. The days that followed passed in silence. Luke repaired a fallen fence near the canyon entrance and helped restore the small structures left by her people. Though no words were spoken, a rhythm began to form between them, an unspoken understanding, a shared solitude. The land, harsh yet beautiful, became their language. As the weeks turned, Luke began to notice signs of change. The flowers bloomed early that season, and the river ran clearer than he had ever seen. The animals that had once avoided the canyon began to return. It was as if her presence had awakened something ancient beneath the earth. The Spirit Bride, they called her. But to Luke, she was more than legend. She was life itself. One evening, as the sky blazed orange and violet, he found the small woven pouch she had dropped before. The one he had carried since that day in town. He placed it carefully on the altar, beside the clay doll she treasured. It felt like a quiet offering, a token of the man he once was and the man he had become. That night, a rare rain began to fall. It swept through the desert in silver sheets. washing the dust from the stones, filling the air with the scent of wet earth. Luke sat beneath the cliffs, listening to the sound of the storm. He thought of the girl he had met so long ago, the one he had joked about marrying. He realized now that what he had spoken in jest had taken root in the heart of a child who believed in promises. And perhaps, deep down, he had believed it too. The rain slowed near dawn. The canyon shimmered beneath a pale, golden light. Luke stepped outside, the ground soft beneath his boots. In the distance, Naeli stood by the river, her face turned toward the rising sun. She looked peaceful, at home in a world that had once cast her out. Something inside Luke shifted again, quiet but certain. The joke had become destiny, and the destiny was becoming real. The time for silence was ending. The past had caught up to the present, and the next step would change everything. The desert dawn broke with a hush, the horizon brushed with pale gold. The rain from the night before had softened the land, leaving small pools shimmering in the low places. Luke Carver awoke beneath the cliffs, his blanket damp, the scent of wet earth in the air. He rose slowly, his joints stiff from the chill, but his heart lighter than it had been in years. He had not planned to stay this long in Silver Creek. He had meant only to pass through, buy supplies, earn a little money, and move on like he always did. But now, days had turned into weeks, and each sunrise tied him closer to the canyon, to the woman who had once been a child with a broken doll. Naeli's presence filled the land like a heartbeat. Since her return, the canyon had changed. The wind seemed softer, the birds louder, the water clearer. Even the settlers in town had begun to notice that the season felt kinder. The same men who once whispered about curses now rode into town, with stories of healed cattle and calm weather. No one dared speak against her anymore. Luke spent his days fixing fences, helping ranchers, and bringing supplies back to the canyon. Though they seldom crossed paths directly, he always found signs of her. Fresh footprints in the sand, baskets left near the river, the faint smell of sage in the wind. It was as if they spoke without words, the land carrying their thoughts from one to the other. But the peace that settled over Silver Creek was fragile. Beyond the horizon, the frontier was changing. More settlers were coming, hungry for land and gold. The government sent surveyors to mark new boundaries, and with them came soldiers. The old treaties were being rewritten, and the Apache who had survived the wars were being pushed farther south into barren reservations. Luke had seen it before, the slow erosion of everything sacred. He knew that when the soldiers arrived, the land would not care who was right or wrong. It would only remember who had walked upon it with respect, and who had not. He began to sense that Naeli's return had not gone unnoticed beyond Silver Creek. Rumors reached him from riders passing through. Stories of an Apache woman seen near sacred sites, performing rituals the government considered forbidden. Some claimed she was gathering her people again. Others said she was seeking revenge for the tribe that had been destroyed. Luke knew the truth was neither. She was not here for vengeance. She was here for closure, for the promise made to her by fate and by a foolish cowboy who once joked of marriage. One evening, as twilight bled into the desert, Luke rode to the canyon. He found the altar freshly tended, offerings newly laid. The small clay doll was gone, replaced by a silver pendant shaped like a crescent moon. Around it, the sand was disturbed, as if someone had knelt there for hours. He felt a chill, not of fear but of realization. She was preparing for something, a ceremony, a farewell, or perhaps a union. The following days blurred together. Luke worked restlessly, haunted by a sense that time was running out. He saw fewer signs of Naeli. The fire pits she once lit remained cold. The baskets were gone. Even the birds seemed quieter, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Then, one morning, he found a trail of white feathers leading from the riverbank toward the high ridge overlooking the canyon. He followed them, climbing the narrow path carved into the rock. At the top, the view stretched wide and endless, the desert rolling away in shades of red and gold. And there, standing at the edge, was Nayeli. The wind whipped her hair around her face, and her garments rippled like the wings of a hawk. She stood unmoving, gazing toward the horizon where the sun rose over the far hills. Luke stopped several paces behind her. He didn't call out. He didn't need to. The air between them was alive with memory. She was the same girl he had once teased by the canyon's edge. And yet she was so much more. The years had shaped her into something eternal. Something the world could wound but never break. For a long moment, they stood in silence, two souls tethered by a promise made long ago. That night, Luke didn't return to town. He stayed near the ridge, tending a small fire as the stars came out. The constellations burned brighter than he had ever seen them, their light reflected in the wet stones left by the rain. He thought about the man he used to be. The drifter, the gambler, the careless fool who lived without roots. And he thought about her. The child who had believed his joke, who had carried his words across years of hardship and exile, only to return when the rest of the world had forgotten. He realized then that the promise he made, however foolish, had given her hope. And now, her faith in that promise had given him purpose. The next morning, he rode into Silver Creek for the last time. The townsfolk watched him curiously as he bought supplies, fabric, tools, and a single ring made from silver and turquoise. No one asked questions. Perhaps they knew better than to interfere with the workings of fate. When he returned to the canyon, the sky was turning crimson. Smoke rose from a small fire near the altar, and the air was heavy with the scent of burning sage. Nayeli was there, her figure outlined by the flames, her hands lifted toward the fading sun. Around her, the wind danced, carrying whispers of a language older than time. Luke dismounted and stepped closer. His boots pressed softly into the sand, leaving prints that mingled with hers. The fire crackled, and a hawk cried overhead. The moment felt suspended between worlds, neither past nor present, neither sorrow nor joy. He didn't speak. Words were useless on the face of something this sacred. When the fire burned low, she placed a bundle of feathers and stones upon the altar. Then, with a calmness that felt both human and divine, she turned toward him. Her eyes met his, filled with the quiet strength of someone who had carried love across a lifetime of storms. Luke understood. The promise was no longer a joke. It had become a vow carved into the heart of the desert itself. The wind rose once more, circling them like a blessing. Somewhere in that sound, Luke heard the echo of his own laughter from years ago, young, careless, alive. It mingled with the whispers of the ancestors, fading into the endless horizon. The sun dipped below the ridge, and darkness began to fall. But in that darkness, there was peace. The past had come full circle, and the promise of the future lingered in the air. As the first stars appeared, Luke knew that the next sunrise would bring something new, something final. The land had waited long enough. Years passed after that morning in the canyon, years that turned the once restless cowboy into a name, whispered with reverence around campfires. Luke Carver became more than a man, he became a story. Those who crossed the desert spoke of a lone rider seen at dawn, moving silently across the horizon, his hat low and a silver ring glinting on his hand, whenever the sunlight broke through the dust. They said he never stayed long anywhere. He drifted from town to town, always calm, always watching the sky as if waiting for a sign. Some said he was searching for something. Others said he had already found it, and was just keeping a promise made long ago. In every town, people had their own version of his tale. To some, he was the outlaw who disappeared after saving a village from raiders. To others, he was the man who once loved an Apache spirit who walked between two worlds. But to those who had seen the canyon where he'd once lived, he was simply the one who waits. Luke himself never spoke of what had happened that day. The memories belonged to the land, not to words. Yet sometimes, when the wind moved through the canyons just right, a faint voice seemed to echo back, soft, melodic, and ancient. It was said that if you listened closely enough, you could hear laughter, like the sound of a girl who had once played with a broken doll beneath the desert sun. Seasons changed. Towns rose and vanished. The railroad came, cutting through valleys once sacred and still. The land grew noisy with the cries of engines and men. But the canyon remained untouched, hidden beyond the reach of greed or steel. One autumn evening, Luke returned there. His hair had turned silver, his face lined from years of sun and dust, but his eyes were the same, steady, searching. He rode the same trail that had once led him to her, though it had grown over with brush and stone. The air carried the same scent of sage, and the faint hum of cicadas. When he reached the ridge, he dismounted and looked down. The altar still stood, half buried by time, yet untouched by weather. The stones were bleached pale, but the red thread she had left was still wound around one of them, faded yet unbroken. The sight stirred something deep within him, a warmth, a memory that refused to fade. He built a small fire beside the altar, as he had done years before. The flames flickered weakly at first, then caught, painting his face in gold. Around him, the canyon came alive, the rustle of wind, the call of distant coyotes, the whisper of old spirits moving through the rocks. He felt her presence again, not as a ghost, but as something vast and eternal, woven into the wind, the sand, and the sky. Luke sat quietly for hours, staring into the fire. He thought of that day. The child who had looked at him with curiosity, the young woman who had returned with purpose, and the spirit who had vanished with the dawn. She had come full circle. And now, so had he. The stars came out, countless and bright, stretching endlessly across the desert sky. He took the ring from his pocket, the one he had never worn but never left behind. It had survived every storm, every fall, every lonely night. He held it between his fingers and set it gently on the stone beside the red thread. The fire crackled softly, then flickered higher, as if catching the breath of something unseen. The air grew warmer, filled with a faint glow. Luke lifted his eyes, and for a fleeting instant, he saw her again. She stood where the light met the sand, her figure cloaked in white, hair braided with feathers, eyes shimmering like amber under moonlight. She was not a vision of sorrow but of peace. The same smile that had once graced her lips touched them again, and the wind moved around her like a living thing. The moment held no fear, no grief, only understanding. Luke rose slowly, removing his hat in silent respect. The two of them stood across the altar one final time, the fire between them as it had been on that morning long ago. He felt the years fall away, the distance, the silence, the waiting. What remained was the truth of their bond, timeless, untethered by the boundaries of the living and the spirit world. The wind grew stronger, swirling dust and sparks around them until the canyon glowed. She lifted her hand, palm open toward him. He reached forward, though he knew he would never touch her again. But that didn't matter. The promise had already been kept. When the light faded, she was gone once more. Only the fire remained, burning steady and bright, though no wind could touch it. Luke smiled faintly. The desert was quiet again, yet filled with something alive. He sat back down beside the altar, his hat resting on his knee, and let the warmth of the fire ease him into stillness. The night deepened, stars reflected in his eyes. His breathing slowed, steady as the rhythm of the earth itself. By morning, the fire had gone out. Travelers passing through weeks later found the spot untouched. The altar stood as it always had, and on it rested a ring beside a single white feather. There were no footprints leading away, only the faint outline of where a man had sat, facing the sunrise. They buried no body, for there was none to find. But every year after that, at the first light of dawn, a faint column of smoke would rise from that canyon. Straight and thin, reaching toward the heavens. The elders said it was a sign that the cowboy and the Apache girl had been reunited in the spirit world. Their vows sealed beyond the reach of time. They became a legend, A story told to children when the desert wind howled through the night. They called her the Spirit Bride, and him the Man Who Waited. And on quiet mornings, when the wind moves just right and the light catches the red rocks at the canyon's edge, two figures can still be seen, riding side by side, fading slowly into the rising sun.